At the risk of being caught somewhat out of season, a few years ago at Christmas, I had celebrated the midnight Mass, which in this parish was held at midnight. But then I had the first Mass the next morning at 6 a.m. So it was a very short night of sleep. What happened at the 6 a.m. Mass was that the cantor was late. She too had also sung at the midnight Mass, so she was quite the trooper, but she was a bit late and arrived during the homily. And of course, seeing some of the reactions on people's faces as she arrived, a bit aggravated, I guess. They hadn't been to the vigil or the midnight Mass. One even raised a hand in disgust as she arrived. I saw this during the homily. I felt compelled at the end of Mass to personally thank her for her time and her talent in singing for us and leading in singing, and mentioning that she had sung at the midnight Mass and also had the 6 o'clock a.m. Mass the next morning at Christmas. And of course I noted that she had been late, obviously, because it was a long night of not much sleep. But I pointed out that what we're celebrating at Christmas is the Incarnation of Jesus, which means God became a human being. And we remember that Jesus is still a human being. And as such, even Jesus needs his sleep. Today, we hear in the Gospel, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to his disciples and demonstrated how human he still was. And as human, Jesus also needed to eat. And it was that basic, simple gesture of eating that put aside any doubts that the apostles had that he had risen from the dead, that this was indeed Jesus in their midst. It's somewhat interesting that the story comes on the heels of the road to Emmaus, in which the men recognized him eventually in the breaking of the bread. As they go back, it says they told the story of how he was made known, and they were also told Jesus had spoken to Simon. Now Jesus appears in their midst, and they still don't recognize him. But it's that simple gesture of eating, a very human gesture of our divine Messiah, that put aside any grief and any doubts that they had. And we are reminded that Jesus continues to be that God made flesh. Not sure how the question of eating or sleeping is solved in the kingdom of heaven, but we certainly see that as a very simple, basic evidence of the truth of the resurrection, that this is indeed Jesus, human, physical, flesh and bones, risen from the dead. And so sometimes it's just very good to keep things simple. They recognized him when he ate in their midst, as he had done so many times before. In our second reading today, St. John gives us also a very basic approach to discipleship. Those who say, "I know him," but do not keep his commandments, are liars, and the truth is not in them. It's a very basic concept. If we say we believe in Jesus, we keep his commandments. If we don't keep his commandments, then we don't believe in Jesus. It would seem a bit of a no-brainer, and yet how often do we see today people who profess to believe in Jesus, and yet their entire value system, what they may advocate in their lives, sometimes even the lifestyle they live, is the exact opposite of what we are called to be and the values and standards we're called to live as human beings. They say they believe in Jesus, or they say they profess a Catholic faith. They say they're devout Catholics, leaving many of us to ask, then why don't you act like one? And we have in the second reading a very, very basic concept. If we believe in Jesus, then we let that faith nourish us. We let that faith govern how we live our lives. We let that faith answer what questions we have. It's not one of a number of things that help to form our consciences and form our values. It is the thing. And it is something that's been handed to us by the apostles, commissioned by the risen Jesus, who ate in their presence. And so sometimes we need to keep things basic and simple. We profess a faith in Jesus Christ. We need to act as if we profess a faith in Jesus Christ. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead. We need to live as people of the resurrection. During this special year in which we are honoring and remembering a saint who was the father of Jesus on earth, Saint Joseph, we can perhaps recognize examples of these very basic concepts in how he lived and how he raised Jesus and took care of his wife Mary. Obviously, he fed Jesus. Jesus was nursed by Mary, his mother, but when Jesus came of age to be weaned from that, Joseph obviously took part in feeding Jesus, and not only in the literal sense, one can say in the metaphorical sense. He fed Jesus the law. He fed Jesus the prophets, the very law and prophets Jesus is referring to post-resurrection in today's gospel. He fed him his Jewish faith and raised him to be the young Jewish man who became our Messiah. He fed him the skills of carpentry. So Jesus was known not just as the rabbi, but as the carpenter. Next week is popularly known as Good Shepherd Sunday because Jesus applies the image of shepherd to himself as Messiah. But we know that that is simply a metaphorical image. He is our good shepherd, but on earth Jesus was a carpenter, given that trade and raised in that work by his father Joseph. And we know Joseph in his basic example of obeying the commands of God, even when the law would have been on his side to not obey. We're all familiar with the story of Mary being found with child, and because it was not Joseph's, didn't want to expose her to shame or the law, so he would divorce her quietly and dismiss her. She would not be his wife. He would break the engagement, break the betrothal. And the law of Moses supported him in doing so. But when the angel of the Lord revealed to Joseph something new in God's will, Joseph obeyed that commandment and showed himself a true son of Israel, a true son of David, and a precursor to all of us who are called to profess our faith in Christ by also obeying his commands. So we see in Joseph multiple examples of true discipleship as he stands with his wife, caring for their son, feeding him, raising him, training him, but also obeying the faith, the law, and the prophets in which he, Joseph, himself had been raised, and which he, Joseph, himself, is passing on to Jesus Christ. And they're very simple, basic concepts. Jesus is risen. Jesus is human. The incarnation is still a reality, even after the resurrection. And we are called to live as people of the resurrection. How do we do that? By first, and perhaps foremost, obedience to Christ in his commands. That is how we demonstrate we are true disciples. That is how we are not proven to be liars, as St. John tells us in the first reading. And that is how we imitate Jesus and his commands, Mary in her perfection of discipleship, and especially in this year of St. Joseph, we emulate the man called to be the earthly father of Jesus, through thick and thin, continuing to nourish his son in his upbringing, but he continues to nourish us in his example of total obedience to the will of God.